Well, feral friends and fellow nature nerds, it's 2025. So welcome to the first episode of the Dispatches from the Forest podcast this year. Hopefully you had a safe and happy holiday season. Now, since we're in early winter here in North America, I want to talk about a snowbird, but not a bird that lives in a snowy area. In fact, these birds migrate if necessary to avoid cold and snow. So it's a snowbird in the way that a retiree heading to Florida in the winter is a snowbird, but it does have snow in its name. I'm talking about the Snowy Plover. So even if the weather outside is frightful, let it snow, let it snow, let it snowy plovers. I'm your host, Tim the Nature Nerd O'Hara, and this is the Dispatches from the Forest podcast. So what exactly is a snowy plover? Well, plovers, whether snowy or not, are small shorebirds. There's 4 species of plover found here in the United States. 2 are widely distributed. The semi-palmated plover winters in the southern coast of the United States and South America, but it breeds in open ground on beaches or flats across northern Canada and Alaska. They nest on the ground in open areas that have little or no plant growth. The piping plover can be found on the Atlantic coast or Ocean Bay beaches of the United States and Canada, as well as the shores of the Great Lakes during the breeding season. These plovers live the majority of their lives on open sandy beaches or rocky shores. And again, these birds will winter primarily on the Gulf Coast and the Atlantic coast of the southeast United States. The other 2 plover species here are a little bit more limited in their range. Wilson's plovers breed along the Atlantic and Gulf coasts and winter on the coast of Florida and South America. But the snowy plover, the main subject of today's episode, is considered to be one of the best studied endemic shorebirds as well as one of the rarest. They're found along the Pacific coast from Oregon down through Mexico and into South America, along the Gulf Coast, Bermuda, and some Caribbean islands, and a limited number of inland areas of Mexico and the United States. Now, I know that sounds like a lot, but they're kind of scattered throughout that range, so it's not as much as it sounds. Adult snowy plovers are pale brown above and white below, with a white band on the back of the neck and usually with a smoky eye stripe. So, why the snowy moniker? I have no idea. Snowy plovers are less than 7 inches long, plump with a relatively big head, a short slender bill, and a short neck and tail. The easiest way to distinguish them from other plovers is by their all-black bill and gray to black legs. Also, compared to other plovers, snowy plovers have longer legs and shorter wings. Their typical call is a repeated too-weet, and it is used in a wide range of situations. Males use this call to advertise for a mate and during courtship. The call differs between sexes. In females, it's shorter, quieter, and hoarser, but in both sexes, it's used to signal a threat, aggression, distress, and alarm. Other calls include a repeated pert sound used during the breeding season, often when flying from nest sites or when other plovers intrude on their territory. A single chirr is given primarily by males when defending territory or offspring from other plovers. And outside of the breeding season, a repeated T sound is given if the bird is disturbed when it's resting, often followed by flight. Chicks start to peep up to 2 days before hatching while still in the egg, and they continue until about the time of their first flight. Snowy plovers eat invertebrates like crustaceans, worms, beetles, flies, and insect larvae. Prey is taken from both above and below the surface of the sand, from plants and from carcasses, although the plover are eating the invertebrates off the carcass, not scavenging the carcass itself. Like all plovers, they primarily locate prey visually by briefly standing to scan the area, then running and catching their prey. They also forage by probing the substrate with their bills or by charging or hopping onto accumulations of flies, also by foot trembling on wet substrates or in shallow water, which is when the bird shakes one foot in order to stir up prey. Snowy plovers will forage during both day and night, and they've been observed feeding in almost complete darkness. They'll drink fresh water if it's available, but if not, they can sustain themselves on the water content of their prey. Now, snowy plovers inhabit open areas where vegetation is absent or at least sparse, particularly the dunes of coastal sand beaches and saltwater lakes. They also breed on river sandbars near the coast and will adopt human-made habitats like wastewater or salt evaporation ponds, dammed lakes, and dredge spoils. They need to be near-ish to water, but sometimes they'll breed in places where there's very little water actually present. At the beginning of the breeding season, males establish and defend a territory, and then advertise to females by calling and excavating scrapes. Like many ground nesting birds, plovers don't build nests. Once paired up, the pair will defend the territory together. Now, territories are defended not only against other snowy plovers, but also against other bird species, including other plover species. Now, for coastal snowy plovers, establishing a territory is probably not so much about protecting food resources, since plovers often feed in flocks and may go nearly 4 miles or 6 kilometers away from their nesting territories in order to forage. It's more about having a good, safe place to raise young. Now, that said, snowy plovers that are more stationary, like those living more inland, may be more inclined to establish a territory around food. After the chicks hatch and the family starts to move around, the adults will defend the surrounding radius around their young rather than a fixed territory. When defending a territory, males may attempt to intimidate intruders with an upright display posture, where they hold their body upright, they puff out their breast feathers. They might also run at, fly at, or even fight with intruders, which is tough talk for a 1.5-ounce bird. Fighting can involve jumping at each other breast to breast with flapping wings, along with pecking and shoving, but fighting dirty isn't out of the question either. Sometimes combatants will pull each other's feathers, even pulling out tail feathers. Fights can last up to 90 minutes, although like boxers, the fighters will often take short breaks. But outside the breeding season, snowy plovers are more social, often roosting in groups that can number more than 300 birds. They typically roost on the ground in depressions, which can include human footprints and vehicle tracks, or behind objects like driftwood. Now, unlike other birds that I've talked about, snowy plovers don't mate for life. In fact, snowy plovers are polygamous, and their system is kind of uncommon among birds. Not only that, but unlike some other species, snowy plover moms are not particularly loyal to their own offspring. Females will often abandon their mate soon after the chicks have hatched. The deserting female often pairs with a new male and re-nests, sometimes going as far as a few hundred kilometers away from its first brood, while the male continues to rear the chicks. But before you judge them too harshly, one study found that females were more likely to abandon their broods when the chicks were either likely to survive, even in their absence, or had a low probability of survival, even if they were around. Polygamy is also most pronounced in areas where the breeding season is long, when birds have time to raise 2 and sometimes 3 broods per season. So this polygamy in snowy plovers appears to be a way to maximize breeding success. And when you generally live less than 3 years, maximizing your reproductive success becomes pretty high on your priority list. Now, even though they don't mate for life, and the female might abandon her mate and brood, pairs are sometimes reunited the next breeding season, and sometimes even in the same breeding season on the 3rd breeding attempt of the female. Like I mentioned earlier, snowy plovers don't build nests, but lay their eggs in scrapes constructed by the male as part of the courtship ritual. A scrape can be constructed in just a few minutes, and it's usually near a conspicuous landmark like a pile of rocks or a patch of grass. The male will make 5 to 6 scrapes on average in his territory, one of which will eventually be selected by the pair for laying their eggs. Both before and during incubation, the adults line the scrape with small objects like stones and shell pieces. Snowy plover lay an average of 3 eggs, but clutch size can range from 2 to 6. If for some reason only a single egg is produced, that clutch is usually abandoned. The female lays an egg every 2 to 5 days until the clutch is complete. Males and females share incubation duties. Usually the female incubates during the day while the male defends the territory, and the male incubates at night so the female can go out and feed. Incubation time varies with both geography and season, ranging anywhere from 3 to 7 weeks. Now, a day or two before hatching, the chicks and parents start to communicate by calling. After hatching, the parents carry eggshells away from the nest. Again, like many ground nesting birds, the chicks are precocial and can walk and swim within 3 hours of hatching. But unlike a lot of birds, plover parents don't feed their chicks. Instead, they just lead them to the feeding areas so they can do it for themselves. But still, in Western North America, chicks are usually looked after for another 4 to 7 weeks after they hatch, frequently by the male after the female has left to start her new family. In the more eastern populations, chicks are often cared for until they fledge, because when you weigh 1.5 ounces fully grown, lots of things will want to eat you, including feral cats, foxes, and birds of prey. And even more things will eat your chicks and your eggs. Adult snowy plovers will usually run or fly away from a ground-based predator or a human. In response to birds of prey, adult nesting snowy plovers duck on their nests, and roosting flocks will take flight and form a highly coordinated flight formation that moves back and forth, which helps distract and confuse a potential predator. Parents will signal their chicks to lie flat against the ground when they sense potential danger, and they might attempt to distract predators from their chicks by calling and flying around. Parents are also known to do a broken wing display, like killdeer, where they run on the ground moving their wings like they're broken or lie on the ground while crouching or flapping to draw a predator away from their nest and their young. Now, like I said, the snowy plover is among the rarest endemic shorebirds in the Americas. In the U.S., the Pacific Coast population has been listed as threatened under the Endangered Species Act since 1993. And globally, snowy plovers have been listed as near threatened since 2014 because of a fairly rapid population decline. On the Pacific coast of the United States, snowy plovers have lost 50 out of 78 breeding sites since 1970. And on the plains of Texas, this decline is estimated to have been more than 75% between 1998 and 2009. As of 2020, the global population is estimated to be between 24,000 and 31,000 mature birds, most of them in North America. And the primary cause for this decline, you ask? Unsurprisingly, habitat loss and disturbance. A lot of coastal beaches have been developed for recreational use. Periodic raking of beaches to remove garbage and natural debris like kelp not only causes plovers to abandon breeding areas, it also reduces both the biodiversity and biomass of the invertebrates that plovers feed on. Dune habitats have also been lost to European beach grass, an invasive species that was originally planted in an effort to stabilize dunes. European beach grass, as well as American beach grass, which is native to the Atlantic coast, has replaced native vegetation along most of the North American Pacific coast. On the Great Salt Plains of Oklahoma, controlled flooding, as well as another invasive shrub, the French tamarisk, have destroyed significant plover habitat. In Texas, sinking groundwater levels from water extraction has been identified as a primary cause of snowy plover decline. Likewise, river habitats in Kansas and Oklahoma have been decimated by water extraction, the construction of reservoirs, and vegetation growth. And because everyone wants to live near the beach, habitat is frequently lost to housing and urbanization adjacent to beaches. On United States beaches, disturbance by humans and dogs has been implicated as a significant cause of snowy plover abandonment in many areas. One study found that at a beach near Santa Barbara, California, each individual plover was disturbed every 27 minutes on average during weekends and every 43 minutes during the week. The study further found that plovers were more sensitive to dogs than to humans, and that most disturbances occurred when the plovers were approached within 100 feet. Another study found that chick mortality was 69% higher on weekends compared to weekdays in 1999, and 72% greater in 2000, which demonstrates the negative effects of human recreation on snowy plovers. Nests also get crushed by vehicles, walked on by humans, and in inland populations by cattle. In addition, in areas with more humans, there tends to be more predation on chicks and eggs by animals like foxes, crows, ravens, and skunks, which all may be attracted by human garbage. Oil spills and other pollution present an additional threat, and in the future, snowy plover will have to deal with rising sea levels and drought driven by climate change, which could intensify habitat loss. There is, however, a recovery plan. Initiated in 2007, a mere 14 years after they were listed under the Endangered Species Act, and this plan focuses on three main conservation measures: closure of upper beach areas to the public during breeding season, protection against predators, and habitat restoration. The closure of beach areas is found to be most effective when it includes fencing to exclude dogs and a 100-foot or 30-meter buffer zone. But believe it or not, closing off portions of public beaches is often controversial with the beach-going public. My wife just came back from a work trip to Vandenberg Air Force Base, which is just north of Santa Barbara, and she heard the claim that the snowy plover were an invasive species, which is, of course, not true. But I guess some people just want to be able to do whatever they want, whether it's having their dog off leash at the beach or riding their ATVs, without having to consider how it might impact anybody else, particularly a small shorebird. And so conspiracy theories are unfortunately not surprising and almost expected. Egg and chick predation can be reduced, though, by fencing individual nests and removing predators as much as possible. Habitat restoration is mostly focused on removing invasive beach grasses and restoring native vegetation. Measures have also been attempted to protect snowy plover habitat elsewhere in the United States. In Oklahoma, dams and fences were erected around nesting areas to prevent flooding and predation, but ultimately these efforts were ineffective. But even though the global population is still declining, conservation efforts have been effective at increasing plover populations at the local level. Snowy plovers reoccupied a breeding area in Santa Barbara County 5 years after enacting protections from human disturbances. In Oregon, roping off a 40 to 50 mile or 65 to 80 kilometer section of dry sand on beaches and removing invasive grasses allowed the snowy plover population to go from 55 birds to nearly 500 between 1993 and 2023. And on the heels of that success, we'll end this episode. If you want to support the podcast, there's several ways to do that. Consider becoming a patron. You can find all the information at patreon.com/dispatches from the forest. One of my goals for this year is to offer a series of webinars, the first of which will be Friday, January 31st at 11 a.m. Mountain Time, 10 in the West, 1 in the East. I'll be talking about one of my favorite topics, coyote myths. The registration fee for this webinar is just $5. Now, if you're a Patreon subscriber, you'll automatically get access to the webinar and a link to the recording afterwards. If you're not a Patreon subscriber, all you have to do is send me an email at dispatchesfromtheforest@gmail.com, letting me know that you're interested, and then you can use PayPal or the Cash App to pay the $5 registration fee. Again, even if you can't be there live, everyone that registers will receive a link to the recording of the webinar. For the Cash App, use the hashtag ForestNerd. And again, for PayPal, use my email address, dispatchesfromtheforest@gmail.com. You can also use that email address to contact me for other stuff, like questions or comments or suggestions for future episodes. Check out the merch store at cafepress.com/shop/dispatches from the forest and click on products to see all the fun stuff we have to offer there. Finally, you can follow Dispatches from the Forest on Instagram, Facebook, and TikTok. I'm your host, Tim the Nature Nerd O'Hara, reminding you to go outside and get dirty. The Dispatches from the Forest podcast is a production of Dispatches from the Forest and may not be used or rebroadcast whole or in part without express written permission.